Emily Dickinson is a true legend of the literary world, although she wasn't known during her lifetime. Along with Walt Whitman, Robert Frost, Langston Hughes, and Sylvia Plath, Emily Dickinson is right up there with the most famous American poets of all time. Dickinson published less than 10 poems in her lifetime, most of which were anonymous. It was only after her death in 1886 that a treasure trove of over 1,700 poems was discovered in her bedroom. Many of them were compiled in little hand-sewn booklets known as fascicles. Aren't we glad Dickinson's surviving family didn't burn them along with her private letters? The recurring themes in Dickinson's poetry include sickness and death, the wonders of nature, spirituality, and society. But these ideas only become clear once you've understood her quirky verses, which can be a challenge. Dickinson's style was so fresh and original for the mid-1800s that it baffled critics and defied categorization. Although her lyric poetry resembles the structure of old-fashioned folk songs and hymns, that's where the similarity ends. Remember, a lyric poem is a form of poetry that conveys powerful emotions. This type of poetry usually has a musical quality to it and is told using first-person language, which is when someone refers to themselves with I, me, or my. Things that distinguish Dickinson's style include her liberal use of dashes, lack of titles, eccentric capitalization, preference for slant rhyme or imperfect rhyme, wildly varying tones or emotions, and offbeat vocabulary choices. Dickinson was way ahead of her time. In fact, thanks to 20th century scholarship, Dickinson is considered one of the forerunners of Modernism. This was an artistic movement that sought to make everything new and break free from the classical definitions and expectations of art. In other words, Dickinson was composing unique, tricky poems before the Modernists made it cool. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's get to know the poet herself. For a start, you probably want to know what she looked like. Dickinson described herself as small, like the wren, and my hair is bold, like the chestnut burr, and my eyes like the sherry in the glass that the guest leaves. What a cool bunch of similes. Remember, a simile is when something is described as being like something else. Born in 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts, Emily Dickinson enjoyed a relatively privileged upbringing. The Dickinsons were an established and important family in Amherst, with deep ties to the community dating back to the Great Puritan Migration. The family lived for many years in a grand brick house built by the Dickinsons' granddad, known as the Homestead. Dickinson's father, Edward, was a prominent lawyer and politician, and her mother, Emily, was a hard-working homemaker. Since both her parents were rather austere or serious people, Dickinson became deeply attached to her siblings, Austen, her older brother, and Lavinia, her younger sister. Although girls' education was fairly limited in the early 1800s, Amherst had a more progressive academic scene. Edward Dickinson, being a highly educated man, insisted on providing his daughters with top-notch schooling. So they both attended the coeducational Amherst Academy, where Dickinson excelled in the sciences, Latin, and of course, written composition. Dickinson also developed a passion for botany, which she nurtured for the rest of her life. In fact, plants and flowers ended up nurturing her. Dickinson's oeuvre, or body of work, is littered with loving references to nature. She characterizes or depicts nature as a dependable companion and usually spells it with a capital N. There are hundreds of examples of this, but a few standouts include "This is my letter to the world," "Nature is what we see," and "Nature, the gentlest mother is." Although nature was always a source of strength and inspiration for Dickinson, her health was fragile. As a child, she was often kept home from school and treated delicately by her parents. Some historians have suggested that Dickinson may have had epilepsy, a condition that causes seizures. Records of the medication she took hint at this, as does the existence of seizures in her family. This could account for Dickinson's later secrecy, seclusion, and refusal to marry. The stigma around epilepsy in the 1800s associated it with hysteria, insanity, and sexual perversion. At that time, people with epilepsy were also legally forbidden to marry. This was the case in 17 US states until as late as 1980. Dickinson was also prone to mental health struggles. When she was 13, Dickinson suffered the loss of her cousin Sophia to typhus. This deeply traumatised Dickinson and caused her to experience a prolonged bout of depression, known in those days as melancholy. It got so bad that Dickinson's family sent her to Boston to stay with family. Once she recovered, Dickinson returned home to complete her schooling. It's also worth noting that from the age of 9 to 25, Emily Dickinson and her family didn't live in the homestead. They lived in a different house in Amherst, which had a prime view of the local cemetery, which must have impacted Dickinson's poetic sensibilities. Her daily exposure to burials and grief resulted in a morbid fascination with the dual menace of illness and death. This preoccupation deepened throughout Dickinson's life as she struggled to cope with the deaths of beloved friends and relatives. This resulted in Dickinson writing hundreds of potent lyrics about death, including "Because I could not stop for death," "I felt a funeral in my brain," and "I heard a fly buzz when I died." In her late teens, Dickinson left home to study at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, an intensive Christian college for young ladies. However, this didn't turn out so well. A combination of homesickness and her refusal to conform to the school's strict religious codes had Dickinson home within a year. Meanwhile, there was a major Calvinist Christian revival going on in Amherst. Despite her entire family converting and joining Amherst's first Congregational Church, Dickinson never formally declared her faith. By the time she was in her early 20s, Dickinson even stopped regular church attendance. She even said in a letter to a friend that she was one of the lingering bad ones. It seems Dickinson was something of a rebel. But this isn't to say that Dickinson lost faith. Far from it. She simply preferred to skip the religious orthodoxy, chill at home, and commune privately with God. In fact, after she stopped attending church altogether in the 1850s, Dickinson wrote a poem that begins, "Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home." Despite being a bit of a rebel, many of Dickinson's poems reflect her devotion to Jesus Christ and explore spirituality with playfulness and wit. To get an idea of how pragmatic Dickinson was, check out this short lyric she wrote when she was about 30. "Faith is a fine invention when gentlemen can see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency." As you can see, Dickinson enjoyed balance. She tempered her faith with reason and expressed her love of science through poetry. Dickinson's major literary influences included William Shakespeare, with a special love for Othello, American transcendentalist poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, the iconic Romantic poet John Keats, Victorian poets Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and the Bronte sisters. Dickinson even named her giant Newfoundland dog Carlo after the dog in Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. However, Dickinson's lifelong friendship with Susan Gilbert was a central influence on her life. When Susan married Dickinson's brother and moved into the house next door, the two women became even closer. In one of the hundreds of letters she sent to Susan, Dickinson said, "With the exception of Shakespeare, you have told me of more knowledge than anyone living." In addition to editing some of Dickinson's poems, Susan also played the role of most beloved friend, influence, muse, and advisor. Some scholars have even pointed to the possibility of romantic feelings between the two women. The tone of some of Dickinson's correspondence certainly makes it seem that way. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the film Wild Nights with Emily and TV show Dickinson have repackaged Dickinson as a queer icon. From her mid to late 20s, Dickinson began to withdraw from society. She wore mostly white, baked a lot, and preferred the company of Carlo over other humans. Actually, that sounds ideal. Free of the demands of marriage and motherhood, Dickinson crafted a meaningful life devoted to poetry, her ailing mother, the homestead's extraordinary gardens, and lively correspondence with a cherished few. Her poem, "I Had Been Hungry All the Years," expresses Dickinson's awareness of a barrier between herself and society. While she was starved of belonging and acceptance, she was too protective of her individuality to indulge in society's plenty and conform to the group. So she stayed home and penned masterpieces instead. From the age of 28 to 35, Dickinson experienced a rush of creativity, a period which coincided with the American Civil War. This historical moment inspired letters and poems that express Dickinson's internalization of the calamity. Some heartbreakers include "It Feels a Shame to Be Alive," "When I Was Small, a Woman Died," and "Inconceivably Solemn." During this time, Dickinson composed the bulk of her canon, or collection of poetry, and made a tentative move towards publication. In 1862, at the age of 31, Dickinson reached out to an author named Thomas Wentworth Higginson. She sent him 4 poems and asked him to tell her if her verses were alive and breathed. Higginson was generally encouraging, but saw Dickinson's eccentric style as evidence of a lack of experience. Embarrassingly for Higginson, he advised her to delay publishing and was unable to categorize her poetry. Little did he know that Dickinson had already written hundreds of poems and was sitting on a goldmine of hand-sewn booklets. Dickinson's correspondence with Higginson lasted for the rest of her life. When he invited her to Boston in 1868, she politely declined, stating that, "I do not cross my father's ground to any house or town." So Higginson came to Amherst, and they finally met in person in 1870. Despite her small frame, Dickinson's intensity led Higginson to admit that he'd never met anyone who drained my nerve power so much. "Without touching me, she drew from me. I am glad not to live near her." In other words, she was tiny but mighty. Ultimately, Dickinson came to terms with her literary obscurity. This can be seen in one of her most famous poems, "This Is My Letter to the World." It's a potent lyric that seems to anticipate her posthumous fame and implores readers to judge tenderly of her. She also expresses her fear of being misinterpreted for centuries in "A Word Dropped Careless on a Page." This hints at the great care she took to craft her poems. She didn't want a single misplaced word to infect her meaning. Dickinson continued to write in her later years, but her output slowed, and she stopped organising her poems. She also became even more reclusive, only speaking with visitors from behind her bedroom door. Local townspeople began to refer to her as the myth. Her father's sudden death in 1874, mother's death in 1882, the shock of her young nephew's death in 1883, and Dickinson's own failing health all took a huge toll on her. In 1884, she wrote that "the dyings have been too deep for me, and before I could raise my heart from one, another has come." Emily Dickinson died of a stroke in 1886. She was buried in a white coffin with her favourite flowers and carried through fields of buttercups to her final resting place in Amherst West Cemetery. At her simple funeral service, held at home, Higginson read one of Dickinson's favourite poems, "No Coward Soul Is Mine," by Emily Bronte. In 1890, Higginson helped publish the first volume of Dickinson's poetry, although it was heavily edited to reflect grammatical standards of the time. This first volume contained 115 poems and was a big success, leading to further volumes and editions over the next century. In the 1950s, a man named Thomas H. Johnson produced a definitive edition of Dickinson's poetry, restoring most of her original punctuation and wording. Those are the poems you're probably reading today. Well done, team. You've just had a thorough rundown on Emily Dickinson's life, poetic style, thematic concerns, historical context, and legacy. Now that you know Dickinson as a person and a poet, will you judge her tenderly? We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.